James Lee McFarland is my name. I'm Josel's son. I'm going to tell you a story of growing up in New York City as a young lad. Didn't know anything, but I saw a lot in my short period of time while I was living in New York. But I really want to tell you guys about what it was like as a young boy, a young lad growing up, living in different neighborhoods in New York. We were a family that traveled from one area of New York to another. In traveling from one area to another, I got a chance to live amongst different ethnic groups, got a chance to see the way they live compared to the way I was living, got a chance to go to school, different schools in New York, and a journey in life, a life of learning. And the reason why I say that is, I stayed in New York until I was 29 years old. And by the time I was 29, I had 10 different residences where my family lived in. And oddly enough, they were not in the same neighborhood. They were in a black and white neighborhood. That's why I call this segment Streets in Black and White. And in doing that, I got a chance to see how white people live, but I didn't break bread with them. I just went to school with them, did a little association with them, but I didn't really know how they lived. Then we moved to the Bronx, where for the first time in my life, I ran across people that spoke Spanish. Now, when I was growing up in New York, Spanish-speaking people were mainly Puerto Ricans because Puerto Ricans were a part of America, so they could come and go with no problem. So now I got a chance to meet and talk with Spanish-speaking people, Puerto Ricans. From there, we moved on to Harlem. And in moving to Harlem, that was the first time in my life I had ever lived in a neighborhood that was all black. So now I'm in an all black neighborhood. Well, I had never been in an all black neighborhood in my life. Started with black folk, white folk, then black folk, Spanish speaking people, and now I'm in a neighborhood with all the brothers and sisters hanging out in the streets. Because you see, it wasn't until I moved to Harlem that I became a real street hanger-outer. And I say that is because everybody hung out in the streets in Harlem. Now, they didn't do that in Corona, and they didn't really do that in the Bronx. But when I got to Harlem, everybody hung out in the street. Now, from there, we moved to Washington Heights. Washington Heights was an all-white neighborhood, and we were the only black family in the whole block, the only black family. So I grew up, at that point in my life, I was 12 years old. And at that point in my life, well, guess what? I grew up during the post, what they call baby boomer time. And that's when babies were born. So at this particular time, the block that I was on had 35 white gentlemen my age and me hanging out in the streets in black and white. That's when I started to realize what white boys were different than the black boys that I dealt with and the Hispanic boys that I dealt with. So I'm going to take you on this journey and tell you about the different things that we did. I'm going to tell you about the journey on their perspective on life that I saw and witnessed uphand. I'm going to tell you about the different games that they played that was so different. Now understand, this is all about New York. But in New York, in all these little different ethnic areas, you there were different games played, there was different reactions on how people handle other people. This was the first time in my life, after traveling south as a child in the summer, that I finally realized what segregation was about, what bigotry was about, what redlining was about. I learned all of this in my journey. So if you guys want to sit back and relax, oh, I got a story to tell you. I got a story to tell you. All right, let's start this journey. You're going to start this journey with James Lee McDonald, Joseph's son. Now, I'm going to start this journey when I was 4 years old, because that's when I started remembering things, when I was 4 years old. Now, I hadn't started school yet, but we lived in Corona, Queens, and we lived in a little 4-unit building. There was a driveway that separated the two buildings. There was 4 units on this side, and there was 4 units on that side. And we had a driveway, and we used to play games in the driveway. Now, on the back side of the building was a huge garage. And this garage was no cars in it, because very few people had cars back then. This garage was full of furniture, where people would store their furniture. Well, as kids, we always played outside, because it wasn't until later in life that I realized one of the reasons why you hear so much about people hanging out in the streets, that's why I call it streets in black and white, is because we didn't have the sophisticated games that they play now. We didn't have all of this electronics. We didn't have social media back then. We didn't even have a television when my journey started. So to show you guys how New York was, we didn't have a television. We didn't even have a refrigerator back then. We had an ice box. If you people know what an ice box is, it looked like a refrigerator, but you put a block of ice in the top to keep stuff cool. Now, it only lasts for about 2 or 3 days, then you gotta get another block of ice. Well, let me tell you about getting that block of ice. There'd be a guy who would come around the streets in New York with a wagon with a lot of ice on it, a little push cart wagon. And my mother would send me, she said, get me 5 cents worth of ice. I'd go downstairs, get this ice, and say, Mr. Joe, I'll just say his name was Joe. Mr. Joe, Mama want 5 cents worth of ice. He'd take out an ice pick and he'd chisel down 5, and he had these big clamps, get that ice, put the rag on his shoulder, and throw it over his shoulder, and take it up to my mother and put it in her refrigerator. Well, it wasn't a refrigerator, her ice box. It keeps your stuff cool. Not cold, cool. It lasts about 2 days. He knew when to come back and fall. Got another piece of ice for you. Then we had a fruit truck guy. Came around with a mule-drawn wagon, and they sold fruit. See, growing up in New York in my day, there were no supermarkets. You had a few what we call mom and pop grocery stores, but in all of New York in those days, there were no, understand what I'm saying? No major supermarkets. You just had these little mom and pop grocery stores. They didn't have convenience stores. They didn't have a gas station on every other block where you get gas, and you had to go out of your way to get all of this. This is what New York was about. Now this is Corona. So growing up in Corona, the black folk lived on one side of Northern Boulevard, and the white folk lived on the other side of Northern Boulevard. You know, you just always hear stories that they tell about the other side of the tracks. Well, this was the other side of Northern Boulevard. But Northern Boulevard was a main thoroughfare. The school was on the white side, not the black side. So all the black kids had to go to the white side to go to school. Now we only mingled with them when we went to school. They used to have a little saying when we were growing up. I went to PS 92. And the white kids used to have this little saying that they said. They said, all the monkeys in the zoo go to PS 92. That they were talking about us black folk. They said, it's when something like all the white kids, something, go to heaven, but all the monkeys in the zoo go to PS 92. I don't really know what they were really saying at that time because I didn't relate racism. But this is New York City, mind you. This is Corona, Queens. My one experience in that school that I never will forget, during a recess time, we were playing ball, and the ball got away from the crowd, and it went over to where two teachers were standing, two white teachers. Now understand, people, in all my life, I didn't see a black teacher, even in the black neighborhoods, until I got into the 8th grade. So wherever we lived, there was always just white teachers. And I remember this white teacher talking to one because the ball went close to them, and I got a chance to hear a little conversation. Didn't hear much, but I heard one of the teachers tell, one of the white teachers tell the other white teachers, see them kids there? They ain't gonna amount to nothing. And she was pointing to us black kids. I still don't know what she meant because I'm a kid. Nobody had ever explained to me what racism was, what segregation was. So here I am going to school there. Now I had a very trying experience growing up in that neighborhood. And it was about one of my best friends named Kenny. Kenny's father never knew what his father did, but they were like the wealthiest family on that block. He lived in a gated front home, drove a Cadillac car. Matter of fact, he was one of the few people on the block that had a car. And Kenny had the play area, so all the boys in the neighborhood would go down to Kenny's house and play ball. Well, I didn't realize then, it wasn't until later in life that I realized some things that I was never told about, being aware of grown folk. They're grown, you're supposed to respect them. I was taught to be courteous and kind. Yes, ma'am. No, ma'am. Yes, sir. No, sir. And I had an experience with Kenny's father when I was 7 years old. It wasn't until later that I started realizing some things. We all played at Kenny's house because he had a little basketball court, little area to play, whereas there were no parks in our neighborhood. We played in the streets. Everything we did was in the streets. And one day, I went to the bathroom in their house. A bathroom in the basement. And his father asked me to take my pants down. And he touched me inappropriate. Now, my mother never told me about that, so I didn't know, but it startled me. I pulled up my pants and I ran out of his house, and I never went back to his house. And I had a whole year left in school before we eventually moved, and I found myself going 4 blocks out of the way just so I wouldn't pass this man's house. I was traumatized, but I still didn't know what had all happened to me. I never told my mother, I never told anybody about this, but I was traumatized by this man because he was my friend's father. And I didn't know what had happened to me. I didn't know anything about that, but I was traumatized. So I would walk 4 blocks out of my way, which all I had to do was go straight down the block, cross the boulevard, and the school was right there. But instead, I went up the block, behind the block, down the block, then over to get to the school. I did that for a solid year. Just so happens that right after that we moved. So I felt the weight of having to dodge going there. I felt this weight was lifted off of my shoulders because I didn't know what this man had done to me. Now he just touched me inappropriately, but it startled me and I pulled up my pants, but he told me, pull your pants down. I pulled my pants down, he touched me and it startled me. I got up, I ran, I got out of there, but I never told my mother. I never told anybody about this. I lived with this for a long time. In the back of my mind, said something wasn't wrong. It wasn't until later in life that I realized this man was a pervert. Now, I got to thinking about all the little kids that went to this young friend of ours' house to play. What did he do to any of them other boys? Because it was only boys now. Did he do the same thing to them, and how far did it go? I don't know. I'm not going to accuse the man, but I don't know. All I know is he touched me, and I know the grown man shouldn't be touching no little boy like that. So I always thought back, I said, wow, how many other boys did this man touch, or what else did he do to them? Well, by then we had moved away. I never went back to Corona again. I never saw my little friend Kenny again. So to me, I just dismissed it. But that was an experience that I experienced going and growing up in Corona. The rest was just playing in the streets. From there, we moved to the Bronx. Now, this is when I learned about territorial rights. Oh, I'm here to tell you. Now, you got to understand, I'm just 8 years old. I don't know about territory. See, Corona, Queens was like the suburbs of the 5 boroughs. And there was no overcrowding. I never saw anybody laying in the street. I never saw beggars. I never saw any of that while we lived in Corona. Well, when we moved to the Bronx, I started seeing some things that just weren't normal to me now. I saw a few winos. I didn't know what a drug addict was, but the reactions that they did told me there wasn't something wrong with them. But then again, the Bronx was like a step up or down, however you want to call it, than Corona, Queens, which was strictly the suburbs. Was people in our neighborhood. We lived in a house at that particular time. And when I started school, no sooner I get into school, I was bullied. Because I was new to the neighborhood, new to the school. Most of the kids that grew up there grew up in the neighborhood. And once again, I'm new. So they started bullying me. And they bullied me for a couple of weeks. Then I finally got mad and decided, you're not going to bully me anymore. And that's when I learned how to fight. I didn't know anything about fighting. I know if I ball my fists up and hit you upside your head, you got a lick coming there. Once I started fighting back, I had no more problems. No more problems. It's just that when you're new, I found out later in life, this happened in all neighborhoods. How do I know? Because I lived in different neighborhoods. But it was a good experience of living there and learning now there was somebody else besides white kids and black kids. There were these other kids that spoke Spanish. Now, they spoke English as well, but most of the time you heard them speaking Spanish. Well, I'm in the 3rd grade when I'm in the Bronx. And I was introduced to an organization called Menacing Cadet Corps. Wow, that changed my life because here was an organization similar to the Cub Scouts and the Boy Scouts. It's where adults catered to young boys. Now, it was designed and set up by two grown men who were ex-military men. One was Colonel Burgee, one was Major Clark. They ran Menacing Cadet Corps. What is Menacing? If you're familiar with the Cub Scouts or the Boy Scouts, it's just an organization of young men being taught by older men safety, rescue, drilling. We learn how to march. Let me tell you, people, you've never seen in your life anything like 200 8, 9-year-old brothers marching like the military. In step, in step. We marched just like soldiers. And in Menacing, they had different levels, just like the military. You became a private, you became a corporal, you became a sergeant based on your merit. But you learn how to march. And now I'm into the crowd now. I'm into the boys, the brothers in the hood. And we always walk down the street marching. To your left, to your left, to your left, right? Just like soldiers. We had uniforms just like the military. Not the little Cub Scout uniforms. We had khaki uniforms just like the military. We had the military hats. When you got your sergeant stripes or your private stripes, you put them on your sleeve, and you were so proud. I'm a private first class. And you stuck your chest out, and you walked around, and you said, mm. And all of a sudden, everywhere you saw little Menacing Cadet Corps guys. Now, because there were so many of us, you didn't know all the guys, but you knew if you saw them in uniform, you just get in step with them. And we marching down the street. To your left, and we had a little chant. To your left, to your left, to your left, right, 3, 4. To your left, to your left, to your left, right, 3, 4. Here we go. That experience, I honestly say, taught me structure. It taught me discipline. Now understand, I'm just 8, 9 years old at this time. And nobody ever taught me about discipline, structure. Even though there was a man in our household, my sister's father, who raised us like we were his children, but he never was a father to us. We didn't call him dad. All I know is the man took good care of us, my brother, myself, and my sister, which was his child, and my mother. He took care of us. It was a beautiful experience, living with this man. Him taking care of my mother, my brother, sister, and his daughter, as if we were a big family. He took us everywhere with us. Then he got a car, so now we could maneuver. We could go over here and over there. My mother's sister lived in an area in New York called Great Neck. Now, Great Neck was kind of an upscale suburb where black folk lived. But once again, they too were divided by this, believe it or not, this same street from Corona ran all the way through Great Neck called Northern Boulevard. And once again, black folk lived on this side of Northern Boulevard, white folk lived on that side of Northern Boulevard. But we grew up, once again, playing in the street, hanging in the street. It was my Uncle Steve that taught me about business. Now I'm only about 10 years old, but he was a business person. They didn't use the word entrepreneur back then. He was just a businessman. And he had a landscaping business. And he was one of the top landscapers in New York. And he did lawns for very, very wealthy, rich white folk. And as a child, when we went out to see, during the summer, my mother always got us out of the city. I love the city because we learned games. We did this, we did that. The difference is country air, grass. There had no grass in the city. It had no trees. All you saw was concrete, brick and mortar. That was okay. So to go out there and visit my Uncle Steve was a blessing. Now, during that time, I'm going to tell you guys a story that I always tell. It's about a young lad and his brother and my grandmother going south every summer for a couple of weeks. We went to Great Neck to my Aunt Thelma's during the summer, and we went south with my grandmother every summer like clockwork. This was to get my brother and I out of the city into a different environment. Now let me tell you about going south. I always wondered why my grandmother growing up never let us sit in the back of the bus. Never let us. We never sat in the back of the bus. Never, 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 never. Didn't know why. I'd always ask her. She'd say, shh, we don't talk about that. I'm still curious. So let me tell you about going south. Every year, my grandmother alternated us going south. One year we took Greyhound or Trailway, was a bus company similar to Greyhound back then, or we took the train. Every year she just alternated the route. Well, let's get on the bus. Get on the bus. My grandmother always sat right behind the driver, never in the back of the bus. When we got to Washington, D.C., we had to get up from where we were sitting and go to the back of the bus. Guess what, people? This was a joy to me because I always wanted to sit in the back of the bus. I always wanted to sit back there. What is it like sitting in the back of the bus? Didn't have a choice. Didn't know at the time. I didn't have a choice. We used to call Washington, D.C. the Cotton Curtain because the minute you left Washington, D.C., you were in the South. So we started calling it the Cotton Curtain. And it became popular amongst the guys that I knew, that I grew up with. The Cotton Curtain was D.C. So we'd get on the bus, we'd head south, and then all of a sudden, the bus would make a pit stop. And people get off, stretch their legs, go to the restroom. But only the white folk could go to the restroom. Black folk couldn't go to the restroom. So my grandmother would tell me and my brother, now y'all go over by that tree, and y'all TT by that tree there. And we did what she told us. I didn't know we weren't allowed in the bus station. Because now we're in the South. Okay. We get to the end of the trail, and we're in Aiken, Edgefield, South Carolina area. Once again, now we get off, and we go into the depot, the bus depot. And my Uncle Matt used to call it the depot. We're going in the depot. Now y'all go use the bathroom. Well, now I couldn't read that well, but I knew my alphabet. My grandmother used to always tell me, you go in the one that's got the C over the door, not the one that's got the W. I didn't realize that was colored and white. The fountains that they had a C, which for colored, actually it was colored, but I knew the C, and they had the W for white, I knew that was white. She said, now you can't drink out of the one with the W on it, you can only drink out of the one with the C over it. Now, the one with the white, the water was crispy clear, cool. The one with the C, the water was murky and warm. But when you're thirsty, you drink it. Same thing with the bathroom. There was never any toilet paper in our bathroom. I didn't know it was what was in the white one because I never went in those. But I know it was dirty and nasty. But you know, when you're a kid, you just do what you're told. Then my uncle would be there waiting for us. Boy, that was a journey. Because he lived on a farm, and we got in a mule and buggy. Now, you grow up in the city, you very seldom see a mule and a buggy. But we would get in the mule and buggy. My brother and I would get in the bed of it in the back with the luggage. And my grandmother would sit up on the seat with my uncle. And my uncle would crack that whip, crack. And he didn't say, see, I watched enough TV back then, because we had TV by then. And they used to always say, giddy up. But my uncle didn't say giddy up. He said, giddy up. He cracked that whip, giddy up. And I kid you not, that mule would look back and just say, hey man, when I'm ready. And we go by it took an hour from the bus station to get to my uncle's farm. Now he got a farm. I'm a city kid. I ain't never been on no farm before. He got cornfields, watermelon patches, sugar cane, cotton, pigs, cows, chicken. Now, the closest I ever came to a chicken was when we lived in Harlem. There's a chicken house there. They sold fresh chickens, and my mother would give me 10 cents and go buy a chicken. They'd snap the chicken's neck, chop them up for you, defeather them. But this was Harlem. But now I'm on the farm and I'm seeing my uncle do that. I'm saying, wow, because before I'm looking behind the counter and he'd do it right in front of you, snap that chicken's neck, chop the head off, pluck the feathers out. We be eating that bad boy that night. Fresh chicken. I'm saying, wow. We go get a watermelon out the patch. We'd run through the cornfields, through the cotton fields, and there was a lake on it. It wasn't until I was a grown man, that wasn't his farm. My uncle was a sharecropper. I didn't know nothing about sharecropping. I knew nothing about the South. The next summer, same routine, but this time we rode the train down. So we ride the train, same thing. We get to Washington. Now we get on the train in New York, and the car is mixed. Black, white, whoever, everybody's on that one train in that car. And all of a sudden, we get to Washington, we got to get out of that car, and we go into one. Now I can read now. And we go into the car, and it's clearly marked colored on the car. So we get out of the mixed train car, and we go into the all colored car. Well, let me tell you something. If you never rode the train and been in a colored car, which only your people, oh, it was like heaven. We shared. My grandmother always made sandwiches and chicken and pound cake. We always had those. And if there was somebody on the train didn't have none, they'd just be sharing it. Boy, and they'd be singing and dancing in the aisle. And I'd say, ooh, I like this, compared to that old mixed car where everybody just sat up there proper. And they just looked at each other. Didn't know who you are, didn't say, my name is this, that, and the other. But when you got in the color car, oh, it was a party. Once again, all the way down, so we got into the South. Where my uncle lived, same thing. Get in the depot, as my uncle called it. You go to, now I knew it was colored and white, what the bathrooms and the water fountain said. I followed protocol. But now, this summer, my uncle would take the kids to town to go shopping, to pick up essentials that he didn't grow, because he grew everything. But he would pick up like flour and salt and sugar, even though he had sugar cane. Now sugar cane don't give you the sugar that you buy in the store. You have to grind that bad boy up. So now we go to town. And now all of a sudden, my uncle tells my brother and I, he said, now, James and Samuel, he said, y'all can't do anything when you go to town like you might want to do what you did in New York. He said, follow your cousin's lead. He said, if you don't see them do something, whatever you were thinking, you can't do that. If you see them doing something, you better do it. That's when I started to realize, still don't know what segregation is, what racism. White folk would come on the sidewalk, we would have to get off the sidewalk into the gutter till they passed. So I asked my grandmother, I said, Grandma, why we got to do that? She said, oh, just do what your uncle said do. Never explained to us why. Then we go to the movie. Well, let me tell you something. You buy your ticket out front, you go around to the back of the movie theater, and you go up some steps. You're sitting in the balcony. Still don't know why. The coloreds sat in the balcony. The white folk sat down on the lower level. So it just so happens that going to school now in New York City, teacher always asks you, well, what'd you do over the summer? Everybody got up there and they said to the class, well, we went fishing, or I went to camp, or we had a picnic, and this, that, and the other. When it came my turn, I got up in front of the audience, proud. My chest stuck out. I stood up in front of my classmate. I said, let me tell you what's going on. I said, we go south every summer. I said, my cousins got it going on in the south. I said, they have their own bathroom and their own water fountain. I said, and guess what? We went to the movie and I got a chance to sit in the balcony, and all my friends gathered around me and they said, wow, what was that like? Not knowing why. Because growing up in New York in those days, the balcony was reserved for adults. Kids couldn't go in the balcony. And me and my friends, every time we went to the movie, always said, man, I sure wish I could go up into the balcony. Man, what is it like looking at the movie from the balcony? I wanted it so bad. Now all of a sudden, I get a chance to do this. I'm saying, oh, this is great. I love it. I love it. Ask my grandmother about that. She would always tell me, shh, we don't talk about that. She always said this. We don't talk about that. I went along in life not knowing what was happening in the South. Not knowing that. And I tell that story every time I get around people because I want them to understand what the world was like then. I grew up all my life not knowing what segregation was, bigotry, redlining. I knew nothing of that until I got grown and realized. Now I'm going to tell you a story later on. It's going to really blow your mind about that. But I didn't know. But this was the streets. Every area that I ever lived in, they played different games. I'm going to tell you about some of those games of moving back and forth. Because mind you now, by now, I had lived in Corona, Queens, which was black and white. The games we played were what everybody played. Kickball, hide and seek, not Johnny Ride the Pony, that came later. Ring-a-lirio, dodgeball. Those are kind of universal games. The Bronx, the same thing. When we moved to Harlem, the same games. But in Harlem, they played a game called Lodies. Lodies was you played it on the concrete, on the sidewalk. It was a little game with boxes. And you had to shoot. We had a bottle cap and you'd put wax or you'd put clay in it to give it some weight. In New York, in Manhattan, in our areas, they call the game Lodies. Find out later, in Brooklyn, they call it Scullies. Then we moved to the white neighborhood, they called it Checkers. Same game, same rules, but they had different names. All of this is in New York City. The white boys played a game. Now we're in Washington Heights, which is the all-white neighborhood. Well, they played a game that they didn't play in the black neighborhood. It was called curveball. There was a universal red ball that we used. Everybody used that little red, pinkish red ball. Every day we played stickball. You played stickball everywhere. But in the white neighborhood, they had a game called curveball. That's where you threw the ball off the point part of the curve, but you ran the bases just like baseball. But they called it curveball. They had a game called strikeout. Now, they didn't have this in Harlem. They didn't have curveball in Harlem. We had other games. Strikeout, they put a square up on the wall, and somebody would pitch the ball and you had to hit it. Because we didn't have athletic fields. So all your games were created in the street. Now, in Harlem, we had a game called Chinese handball. You played against the wall, because when you live in a tenement area, there's always a wall. Okay, where you go, there's always a wall, because most of the first floor apartments were elevated above the street level, and there was a wall up under there. So you always had a wall, played everything. The white boys had a game called Errors. They didn't have it in Harlem. Once I moved from Washington Heights, and I'm gonna get back to Washington Heights, back to Harlem, I taught them those games, because they were just different. So you had more to play. But when I moved to the white neighborhood, we're the only black family on the block. There's 30-something guys my age, product what they call baby boomers. But there's 30-something guys my age and me. My brother didn't play. My brother had asthma, so he never went outside to play. But I'm out there. The very first time in my life that I was called a name out of character is when I moved to the all-white neighborhood in New York City. We lived there for 2 years. And for 2 years of my life, once again, I heard 3 words: nigger, coon, and spades. They used those words every single day that I lived there for 2 years. I'm still hanging out with my friends in Harlem, because we had moved to Harlem. I never told them about that, because I didn't want to start any trouble. But this was that neighborhood. Now, in Harlem, oh, it was a beautiful thing. I'm with my people. There was always a block party going. You heard music 24/7, and the people hung out on the streets 24/7. I don't care what time of night you went downstairs, there was somebody out. When I lived in Corona, Queens, after it got dark, the streets were empty. When we lived in the Bronx, after a certain time, especially 11 o'clock. Now, brother can tell you about 11 o'clock, you better be home, boy, about 11 o'clock. I mean 11, they used to say 11. I don't mean 11:05, I mean 11. And that's what I heard all my life. Go to Harlem, it was different. 12, 1 o'clock at night, you'd be out in the street. Babies, they'd be pushing baby buggies at that time. 4 o'clock in the morning, you might have a dozen people out on the street, 4 o'clock in the morning. There was always somebody hanging out. This was Harlem. The games we played were totally different than what they played in other neighborhoods. In the white neighborhood, they had a game called Johnny Ride the Pony. That's where you had 5 or 6 guys, and they formed a line of bodies. And with that line of bodies up against the wall, you had 2 teams. One round, your team was the wall. The other time, your team was the jumpers. The object was, when you created this like wall, the jumpers would jump, land on your back, and try and cave the wall in. If they caved the wall in, then they got a chance to go again. If the wall held, you switched, and now they became the wall. That was the games. That was the difference in what we played. That's how life was. Streets in black and white. That, my friends, is just part of it. Oh, it gets deeper than this. But I just wanted to let you guys know what it was like growing up in the streets. Then we had the art form. The white neighborhoods had this. The black neighborhoods had this. The Spanish neighborhoods had this. That's the art of sneaking on the subway. Sneaking on the subway became an art. It was when I moved to the white neighborhood that the refinery of sneaking of the subway came about. In the black neighborhood, you just jump over turnstiles when the train was coming. The white neighborhood, they created a science out of this. You had to know when to jump over the subway. You had to know when to listen for the train. If it was an elevated station, and a lot of the elevated stations were mainly in the Bronx and Brooklyn and in Queens. In Manhattan, they were underground. If they were elevated, you could look down the track and see where the train was. Now, when the train left that station down there, is when you ran up the steps, jumped over the turnstile. By the time you did that, train be pulling in. 'Cause you see the train coming. That's how they did it. We didn't have the elevated stations in Harlem. So what we would do is, you had 2 sides of entrance, one on this side of the street, one on that side of the street. So we sent a runner. This is Harlem now. The other was the white neighborhood. So in Harlem, what we do is, we sent a runner to walk down the steps. The token booth was here, and come up the other side. You listen to when the train was coming, so that the token person didn't get suspicion. We sent a different guy down. So she see another guy. He'd walk, he'd listen. You could hear the train coming when you're underground, and he'd come upstairs. Then we would send another person down. When the person finally could hear the train coming, he got upstairs. We're on both sides of the street now. Hit the signal, and that would mean now we run down the steps, jump over the turnstile, go down the steps, the train be pulling right in. We jump on the train, train be gone. You know, like I say, we made a science out of sneaking on the train. Then we had, how do you sneak on a bus? Well, we played He Got It. Now what was He Got It? He Got It was, we didn't have enough car fare for everybody to ride. So we put our money together and we get 1 car fare up. Wow. How did we get there? There might be 4 or 5 of us. Buses were always crowded, and everything was crowded. Public transportation was always crowded in New York. So how did we do that? How did we pull that off? It's real simple. The little change booth that was in the front of the bus, where you drop your change in there, back then to ride the bus was like 12 cents. So you always either had a dime and 2 pennies, or 2 nickels and 2 pennies. So I got on there, the driver look at you to put your money in the thing. I said, oh, he got it. Next guy come along, he look at him and say, oh, he got it. About four of us. And the next guy get on and say, oh, he got it. Then the fourth guy would come up there and he would drop the little 12 cents in there. And the bus driver said, well, what about them guys? What guys? I don't know them guys there. And we all on the bus. Bus crowded. Now he gonna stop to try and get us out of there because there's a whole lot of young cats on there too. He don't remember who was who, but that's what we call he got it. That's how we snuck on the bus. There's all kind of ways of doing things. Now I'm gonna tell you something that I did when I lived in the white neighborhood. The first year I went to school there, this was a junior high school, 115. They called it Humboldt. When I got to that junior high school back then, I'm in the 7th grade, there's 8 black students and 2,000 white kids in the whole school. Find out the other black students that went to that school were in the same predicament that I was in. We were the supers kids. See, my sister's father was a superintendent of a big time building up there. And we were the supers kids. So that's when I learned about how racist that New York was. Because he was a super, the super in those days did everything. They rented the apartments, they collected the rent, they cleaned the building, they put out the trash and everything. At a very young age, I learned how to do those things with my sister's father, William Griffin. Because I always wanted to see, man made a lot of money. He always had a pocket full of money because people would tip him and give him, because he could fix anything, he could do anything. That's when I started learning how to fix things and make things, watching him. Well, in doing that, I'm in school, my 7th grade, there's 8 of us and 2,000 white kids, because all them schools in New York got 2,000 plus students in them. I don't care what grade it is, you got 2,000 kids because there's so many kids in the neighborhood. Well, I'm learning all of these traits that he did. I was 12 years old, and I used to have to shovel coal in the furnace to keep the building warm in the winter. Now, they had no air conditioning. Apartments in New York do not have air conditioning unless you install your own. So I'm learning how to shovel coal in the furnace to keep the building warm. Because in all buildings in New York, they don't have central air, nor do they have central heat. When the super give you heat, that means the whole building gives you heat. If super don't give you no heat, whole building cold. I heard the man tell William Griffin, my sister's father, time and time again, sometimes in the winter, he would tell him, say, now, Will, cut back on the coal. Now, the difference was this is an all-white building. So what that he was doing as a black folk. It's an all-white building. And he told him, cut back on the coal, because the coal bill is a little too high. So he would fire up the furnace early in the morning. Once the building got warm, he'd shut the system down. Now, if you home in that building during that day, oh, you're cold, because it gets awfully cold in New York. Then I remember him telling, if an apartment became available, he'd come to him and he'd say, Will, apartment 2F is going to be vacant next month. So he put a little for rent sign out there. And then he would tell Will, he said, now Will, you know we don't rent to colors. I'm saying to myself, okay. Y'all on renter cutlass. So now I'm understanding what segregation is. I'm understanding the bigotry of life. Now I'm understanding why black folk and white folk did not coexist in New York City on no equal level. I'm seeing it firsthand. I witnessed it. I heard it. I lived this part of the streets. But yet I'm still hanging out in the streets. Streets in black and white.